Thanks so much, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you today and to be in a place that's so focused on taking action. So I lead the Climate Cares Centre and Connecting Climate Minds, which is a Wellcome-funded global initiative. And Climate Cares is based out of Imperial College in London. But I'm from Adelaide in Australia, so very familiar to extreme heat. I have two nephews under 2, and based on research done in the last few years, globally, children born in the time of my nephews will face about 7 times the number of heat waves as their grandparents. So, you know, I grew up with a lot of heat waves, but compared to my parents' generation, my nephews at the moment face 7 times that number of heat waves. And when I was last home over the Australian summer, the koalas around my family's house are struggling to get water. They're coming to us. The trees are dying. And to be honest, it's heartbreaking. It's distressing for me and my own kind of mental health and well-being at that level to just witness these changes to the landscapes that I love and know dearly and care about the most. And I know that that's, again, the tip of the iceberg for the realities that people are living through all around the world. But in terms of why I'm here, that's sort of my why. So we're going to hear after me on the impacts of heat on the brain. I'm a neuroscientist by background as well, but I've been working at the nexus of climate and mental health for about 6 years. And one of the reasons that I came into this space, it's many, but when I started to look at research that showed that, you know, when there is higher temperatures, more people die by suicide. And I'd worked in mental health for quite a while. I have my own lived experiences of mental health issues. And I was really shocked that I'd never heard of that. No one had ever talked about those impacts. And actually, there's a wide range of mental health outcomes that are affected by heat. So we see, sadly, increased cases of suicidal thoughts and deaths by suicide, increased symptoms of mental illness, worsened physical ill health or even death for people living with mental illness, and worsened population mental health. But this is a complex and emerging relationship. The research is quite nascent, really, especially at a global level. And it's quite difficult, which is why we need all these physiologists to look at these relationships, because they're complicated by the temperatures people actually experience, as well as what's outside, interactions we've already heard with humidity, also with sunshine hours. And it's all about what's relative to that local environment and what is abnormal or normal for that environment rather than the absolute temperature, and including across seasons. So it might be that a hot night, for instance, even in winter, affects people's sleep and leads to worse mental health outcomes the next day. There's data on that now. So it's not just about extreme heat. It's all about what's normal for that area and that season. But again, these are complex relationships. The evidence that we have so far, so there was a systematic review last year in World Psychiatry showing that there is highly suggestive evidence that for every 1 degree increase, even in short-term exposure to temperature sort of above local thresholds, that you get increased risks, as I said, of suicide or mental disorders, related mortality, so people are more likely to die. Sadly, and again, this is the most extreme outcome, obviously, so that's the tip of a wider iceberg, as Marina said before, including higher risks of suicidal behaviour and hospital access or admissions due to such conditions. And I led a study at Imperial, was published a couple of years ago, where we also tried to synthesize the evidence that existed for how ambient temperature affects mental health outcomes. It was really difficult to do the meta-analysis because and as we showed in a huge table in the appendix, if anyone's interested, there's a huge variety of heat exposures that have been used. So the way temperature is measured is very heterogeneous. The mental health outcomes that are measured, very heterogeneous. The modelling that is done, the confounders that are used, all very heterogeneous. So that makes it really difficult to actually look at this consistently, and we really urge some focus on that. But we did see that when there was, for instance, per 1 degree increase in daily mean temperature, again, the suicide risk was rising by about 1.7%, and there was a jump of about 10% higher incidence of hospital attendance for psychiatric disorders in heat wave periods versus non-heat wave periods. And we've heard anecdotal evidence of this from people around the world, including in Connecting Climate Minds, from psychiatrists, from people working in emergency rooms, seeing these impacts in their daily work. But also importantly, again, because those outcomes are the pointy end, we see this across the wider population. Again, in various ways this has been measured, but even people looking at, say, the sentiment expressed on social media posts, Twitter data has shown that as it gets hotter, and these are non-linear relationships, but at this higher end of heat, people are less positive and more negative in what they're writing on social media. So this is a wider kind of population effect. One interesting thing I think is interesting to also point out is that, again, mental health is not a monolith. There is a whole range of ways that people's daily life, quality of life, their mental well-being might be affected, but also people living with different mental health conditions can be affected differently. So I helped supervise a student, Pip Cleary, who looked at using smartphone data, was looking at the impact of temperature on depression symptoms and manic symptoms in bipolar disorder. And what she found was actually, while an increase in daily mean temperature was associated with increases in manic symptom scores, it was actually led to a reduction in depression scores, which could also be around, again, the context of this being in the UK and different things that are happening in that temperature range versus if it went to more extreme temperatures. But again, we can't think of this as a monolith. Another aspect that I mentioned at the start is that while we've heard a lot about elderly people, outdoor workers, another group that often gets missed but is critical is people living with mental health conditions are more at risk of these impacts of heat, including those physiological pathways. So in the Canadian heat dome a few years ago, schizophrenia was the chronic disease most associated with risk of death. So more people died who had schizophrenia than any other chronic illness. There's been various estimates. Again, they're all a little bit different, but they've sort of said 2 to 3 times, sometimes more, what these risks are depending on the different mental health conditions. Again, just to kind of caveat that a recent systematic review found that with people living with mental health conditions, they had worse morbidity and mortality in all studies they found where they looked at high temperature on a single day. But they had some mixed findings when they looked over longer periods. And that's another aspect to this is the temporal nature of this, because people are exposed to heat. They could be on one day, it could be cumulative over multiple days. There can be lagged effects. So are we looking at hospital admissions on the day of the heat or the 5 days later? People have looked at this in different ways. And also, I'm going to get on later to what could be longer term impacts of a short-term exposure. In the words of so Connecting Climate Minds, I should say, we heard from around 1,200 people from 126 countries. We had a whole series of dialogues to produce research and action agendas for what are the priority research questions in the nexus of climate change and mental health that are needed to shift the needle in policy and give policymakers and decision makers the evidence they need. And people were talking about their own lived experiences. And heat came up a lot, but also the interactions of that. It doesn't occur in isolation, right? It occurs in interactions with drought, with air pollution. So one participant said, it's been the most stressful thing to observe how not just the air, the visibility, how we're living in the city in the hot later months of the year. So even my friends who I've asked, my family members, they don't feel comfortable going out. It causes severe headaches and have caused us a lot of stress just in general. And we heard how people were isolated in their homes. They were saying, I'm socially isolated. I'm not going out to meet friends. I'm not going out to exercise. I'm not going out to do all my typical coping strategies. And both psychiatrists and people living with mental health conditions were saying, this is deeply affecting me because I'm effectively stuck in my home, in my little air-conditioned bubble sometimes because it is too hot to leave my house. And we heard this from parents talking about their kids and saying, my child is saying, I want to go out and play, or my children's school is shut because it's too hot. Neil Jennings, who is over there, did this work and surveyed people in the UK about their experiences of extreme heat in the last 5 years. And actually people who self-reported living with a mental health condition were the most likely to report that their health was negatively impacted by extreme heat, more so than people living, as you can see, with heart conditions or lung conditions. Why is this? So Wellcome's actually funding a bunch of research that's about to start looking at the pathways and mechanisms by which heat affects mental health outcomes. A lot of these are currently hypothesized, and we heard about this in Connecting Climate Minds. They can be across the whole spectrum of biological, which is why we have our physiological colleagues here. So you're going to hear in a moment the effects on the brain when our bodies are under that heat stress and we're having that physiological stress reaction, and what can happen to blood flow, to cognition, to our mood and our affect as a result of that. But also there are interactions with things like pharmaceuticals that are given, some antipsychotics and antidepressants. So people, again, living with mental health conditions, it also seems that certain mental health conditions fundamentally change your body's ability to thermoregulate. Also, people living with mental health conditions might be less likely to know or to remember to do things like hydrate properly or wear appropriate clothing. And there's interactions with a lot of other inequalities. For instance, they're more likely to be in insecure housing situations. Also, extreme heat or higher temperatures, there's higher risks of violence and aggression, reduced economic output, as we've heard, impacts on sleep, impacts on our general daily activities and our usual coping strategies. So all of these interact in complex ways that we'll hopefully find out more about in the next years. And as I noted, this widens existing inequalities. So climate change is essentially a risk multiplier. People most vulnerable in our societies are going to be the ones that cop it first and worst. And we need to make sure that the adaptation measures aren't making the situation worse. So, this person, these are cartoons that came out of Connecting Climate Minds, and this person enjoying their air conditioning while essentially worsening the surrounding temperatures. And that access to green space, that access, so the urban heat island effect means that people who are living in more dense and highly concreted, less green space areas, who tend to be poorer, are less protected from that heat. And also people in certain groups of society. These effects happen kind of instantaneously, some of them. So we see, for instance, people going to hospital with mental health conditions or being at high risk of suicide, sadly, like more in the moment of those changes in temperature. But I want to note that some of these effects are going to ripple throughout the life course, across geographies and across generations. There is emerging research that temperature exposure, either in the womb, and I know some colleagues at the conference, I was talking to them yesterday, are working on this, can change neurodevelopment. And there's evidence that the white matter structure in your brain is affected by extreme temperature exposure in early childhood, and that this comes with risks for mental health and cognition later in life. It's also affecting the milestones of people's life. So we heard from young people that these extreme heat events are disrupting their access to education. It affects their ability to learn, and that affects their mental health and well-being. So these things can be cyclical. We've heard already about groups in society that are particularly affected, like outdoor workers. We heard about this also in Connecting Climate Minds. And it's important that a lot of people were talking about, as we just heard, that insecure work where they're forced to work because they need to feed their families in very challenging conditions, and they can't take care of their own health because they're trying to provide for their families. But this is causing big mental health impacts as well as physical health impacts. But also the high temperatures, there's evidence that's been shared, particularly in India, for instance, in an IIED report, that extreme heat is leading to crop failures, and that has been linked in their analyses in the last couple of years to more farmer suicides, for instance. And one of the research priorities that came out of Connecting Climate Minds was understanding how this long exposure to extreme heat affects mental health as well as We heard before other aspects of health. But also, if you're getting crop failures, this is going to create ripple effects into food insecurity, malnutrition. That affects children's development as well. So these effects of something like heat, we can think of it in the moment, but it's important to see how this ripples out across time and space. How is policy responding? I cannot agree more that it is not enough to talk about all of these problems without talking about the solutions. And from a mental health and psychological perspective, people are feeling extremely powerless. They kind of know how bad the situation is, but what do they do about it? Why should they think about it if they can't see themselves reflected in opportunities for action or to see that vision of the future that we're aiming for? I was recently involved in an analysis led by Columbia of are heat health action plans considering mental health? And most of them are acknowledging it. So they're people get that you need to now put mental health into these reports, and it's listed, but it's often listed along with a whole bunch of other things. And most don't acknowledge the specific impacts we're talking about, again, just having this monolith of mental health, but also the solutions aspect is really missing. So only 27% at the moment include targeted interventions, and most are at a level of society. Whereas what we hear from people around the world is, while we definitely need those structural changes, what matters to people to cope with what's happening, and we know that from our own lives as well, is often the strength of our communities, the strength of our social infrastructure. Is someone looking out for you? Is someone reminding you to drink that water, or making sure you get to a cool location, for instance, as well? And also, low-income countries were completely not represented. To not just, again, stop with the problem, to offer some good signs of what's happening. This is from my home state of South Australia, where there's doing a lot of work because it can get extremely hot. And they are including people with mental health conditions in the work that they're doing in public health and heat health warning systems. And really importantly, and what we heard this morning, was that unless you account for the health benefits of these actions, you're missing the point of why this becomes a cost-saving endeavour. So the cost of activating this warning system, for instance, was nearly 600,000 Australian dollars, but that was 3 to 5 times back just in the health savings alone. But unless you're quantifying that and accounting for that, then it's very hard to get an appropriate cost-benefit analysis. This is another example from Dakar, where in last year, in response to the longest recorded heat wave, they did a very widespread early action protocol with a lot of different elements to it, but they also had psychosocial health experts at the first aid stations as part of medical teams in cooling stations, so people can start to recognize and respond when these symptoms and when these issues are coming up for people. One other thing just to highlight is work from Kenya. This is again work with farmers in Kenya who are experiencing more and more, other events as well, but also more and more extreme heat that's affecting their crops. And again, the focus on community, and there's an amazing program called Agri-Psych Beam, looking at access to community mental health services for women smallholder farmers, led by an amazing woman called Mercy. So if you'd like to check out any of the other case studies we have, you can go to the Connecting Climate Minds Global Online Hub, and you can see case studies from all over the world. We're really keen to showcase and learn from solutions. And what we heard in Connecting Climate Minds was exactly what the wonderful last speaker said, of that communities are vulnerable, but they're also extremely resilient. And as the IPCC says, resilience is not just about the capacity to bounce back, but the capacity for transformation. And so how do we learn from and strengthen that capacity for transformation, including considering the psychological and social aspects of the climate crisis? Thank you very much for having me.